everyone, my name is Beena Amanat, and welcome to today's episode of AI Ignition. I lead our global Deloitte AI Institute, and today on AI Ignition, we have Jeremy Jurgens. He is the managing director and head of the World Economic Forum Center for the Fourth Industrial Revolution. His responsibilities are broad and include oversight of all industry initiatives, innovation, and technology pioneer communities, the forum's offices in China, India, and Japan, as well as the Center for Cybersecurity. Jeremy, welcome to the show. I am so excited to have you on the show today. We worked for several years together in your role as the World Economic Forum and across my career path. So I am looking forward to have this conversation with you and learn more about you, the work you're doing, and the World Economic Forum is focused on. So,
Thank you,
Jeremy,
Beena.
welcome.
Great to be here today.
Thank you. So I'd love to start by asking you about your career journey. Can you share a little bit more about, how you got to where you are today?
Yeah, well, I've these things go back. You probably don't want the full history, but I spent a lot of time on emerging technologies among other areas today, and a lot of that fascination actually started in childhood. And that was an area I continued to pursue, through university there. And then, during my studies, or after my studies, had the chance to work at Microsoft in language learning software. Then after that, 25 years ago this week, I actually moved to the World Economic Forum. And, there was an opportunity to say, what's great about software is the ability to scale impact, especially with educational software and so on. And then World Economic Forum, we reach out to global leaders. And so it's another way to have impact. And then when you combine, world leaders with software, then you get some interesting opportunities to share and exchange, similar to what we're doing today here.
Yeah. And AI, you've seen the evolution. Everything that you said resonates because, and I'm going to date myself here, but we've seen, things that we read in fiction and thought were just imaginary actually becoming real in our own lifetimes. I mean, how cool is that, right? So, how we remember when the early books around robots and AI doing things, it seemed so fictional. And as it's happening today, AI is at the center, right? Everybody is aware of AI, especially in the last 18 odd months. There is so much awareness of AI. What what do you think about the conversations that's happening with AI? How do you see AI playing a role in society going forward and its impact on human interactions?
Yeah, so I think it's a great question, although I would challenge one assumption there. I think, for a lot of the people that we're speaking to, and I think also listening to this podcast, CEOs, policymakers, board members, and so on, they're very familiar with AI. What surprises me is, I'll go to when I'm out in the field, meeting, different individuals. You'll often ask, okay, how many of you actually use, one of these, popular tools and so on? And I'm actually always surprised at the number of people who've read about it, but haven't actually tried it or used it there. And so I think we're still in the very, very early stages of what's possible there. And in a sense, and I think you know this well, and I've been working in it, we've been working with embedded AI for over a decade now, right? And before you didn't want to call it AI, it's like machine learning. You don't want to overstate how impactful it was, and not like these companies that one day they're doing crypto and the next day they're doing AI. If you were serious about it, you say, okay, we do machine learning, statistics and so on. So we see machine learning and AI through a number of services, right? How credit cards get processed, how food gets delivered, logistics in delivery companies, large retail organizations. Yeah. So we've already had AI, in a sense, machine learning very close to us, but it's just recently that people recognize it as being visible. It's something that they could directly interact with, and it wasn't behind a search box. Behind that, you actually feel that you're directly interacting with it and writing these queries in natural language to generate an image or a text. And so this is changing. So I think where we're going is that we'll actually see AI embedded in even more of
Yeah.
our daily experiences, but
Yeah.
often in a hidden way, so people won't even necessarily know that they were doing it. And at
Yeah.
the same time, we'll also see AI more visible, and we'll see it growing in both domains. And I think for leaders, it's important to recognize that this is taking place in both areas.
Mm.
And just because we don't see it doesn't mean it's not there.
Yeah.
And even if we see it, it doesn't necessarily know what how that implications will or how that will play out there.
Yeah, yeah. What about human interactions? Like this conversation we are having, I can visualize an era where we could be talking in completely different languages,
Mhm.
and but you would when it so say I'm speaking in French, which you if you don't understand, it'll translate it to English, and you would still hear it in my voice, and it's all happening real time. How do you see AI's impact on human interactions? On how that actually could improve or change.
Yeah, we're still early days. I love the
Yes.
translation example. I've been traveling a lot recently. I was just in
Yeah.
India last week and seeing how they're using AI there. And that was one of the questions that came up is a lot of the models that are currently
Yeah.
most prominent right now have been developed in the West, developed based on English language data sources. And so there's efforts to actually, develop non-English sources with data from different cultural contexts, different linguistic contexts. And
Mm.
so as
Hmm.
we move forward with these tools and capabilities, I think
Yeah.
it'll facilitate connections. And then the more connections we have,
Yeah.
personally, I think actually we end up in a better space, right? Better understanding, better empathy. But
Yeah.
translation is one example or interpretation. Another great example is in medical care.
Oh yes.
So
Yeah.
the extent that a machine learning device could actually take over some of the paperwork, automate filling out the forms, then that can help the quality of the interaction between the doctor and the patient. And
Yeah.
so that also changes the interaction because things that end up being offloaded in
Mm.
terms of potentially administrative documentation work actually can then leave more time for human interaction and
Yeah.
enhance the quality of personal experiences there.
Yeah, my doctors recently started using a device to capture the notes, and I can definitely see more of that interaction, that FaceTime, looking in the eye and asking the questions instead of getting distracted to also capture notes on the computer. So I think there is so much it can do, but I also worry about entire languages getting eradicated over time if we do not capture that language. And it might be something a very small demographic that uses it, right?
Mhm.
How do we ensure that AI is including those languages? And that's a huge challenge. You're in a global role and you're seeing all
Yeah.
these massive global challenges that we're facing, right? Language seems a minor one compared to climate disaster, the global health crisis. How do you see AI addressing some of these challenges, or is beginning to address these challenges?
Yeah. Over the last, say, 12 months,
Yeah.
I personally felt there was a little bit of excessive fear. It's
Mm.
not that the AI is without risks. Of course, there's
Yeah.
risks in all technologies, but I felt it was a bit excessive, right? Especially this existential risk. And I'm sure there's a crowd out there that say, no, 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 you've misunderstood it. It's because I think some of these other risks, another
Mhm.
major health crisis or pandemic, um, climate issues, and so on, these are for me much more immediate risks
Yeah.
as well.
Yeah.
And how do we then actually use AI to address some of the immediate challenges we have of equity for people, inclusion
Yeah.
across socioeconomic divides, and other areas? So, maybe I could just share a couple of examples where I've seen really
Yes.
positive use cases.
Yeah.
So one, I'm just back from India, and last year we ran a pilot with 7,000 chili farmers. So we're
Mm.
saying, okay, how could digital tools help these smallholder farmers? They're growing products. They're, in many cases below the poverty line, near the poverty line. And okay, could they use that? Now, in a lot of Western use cases,
Yeah.
technology is often seen to displace labor, right? So we're going to automate a role or a function out and then displace that. But if you go to large population countries, this is the last thing you'd want to do, right?
Yeah.
Because then what would these people do? And you don't want to take the livelihoods away. And so here, we actually did this pilot initially with 7,000 chili farmers. We were able to, with digital information tools sharing through some of the digital public infrastructure there, reduce the amount of water usage, so water
Mm.
could be used more effectively, reduce the amount of pesticides that were used, so they're also being used more effectively. But overall, quite positive there.
Yeah.
Could we actually improve the yield of the crops through
Mm.
data
Yeah.
sensing, so on, and then improve the time to market, right? So a lot of food gets wasted in the trip to market.
Mm.
So when you took all these different interventions combined, and we worked across multiple
Yeah.
Indian companies, we were able to effectively double the farmers' incomes in this first pilot. Now,
Wow.
sometimes you say, okay, that's a pilot, 7,000, it's highly controlled. So
Yeah.
we
Yeah.
did a second crop cycle, and then it
Yeah.
was scaled out to 50,000 farmers.
Uh-huh.
Um, we've just completed that. Similar results. We're still calculating the data. And we're
Yeah.
now in the process of starting a third pilot with over 200,000
Wow.
farmers. And we're already looking at a next pilot to 500,000 farmers. So this
Wow.
is in a space of less than 2 years, being able to
Wow.
see demonstrated results and
Yeah.
using kind of, agile software development processes,
Mm-hmm.
iterating on each section, learning from it, and
Mm-hmm.
scaling that out. Now, it helps here that India, in this case, has an amazing public infrastructure that they've been working on, both
Yeah.
with their national identity elements, their payments interface, and so on. But a good example of how even a low-income farmer can
Mm.
actually receive direct and immediate benefits from digitization process. Now, I don't want to say
Wow.
this was all AI, because there's a
Yeah.
lot of other digital
Yeah.
tools and services involved here. But if you
Yeah.
look at the full ecosystem, then AI
Yeah.
does become an important element to this, and our
Yes.
ability to scale that out to an even larger cross-section of farmers
Yeah.
is really important, because there's more farmers that look like the Indian farmer
Yeah.
around the world in our 8 billion fellow citizens than there are
Yes.
maybe farmers riding in their, GPS connected tractor and covering, hundreds of acres a day.
Yeah.
That model fits there, but these solutions can actually go to a very large audience. So I think for me, that's one of the really positive examples I've seen just in the last year here. And of course, there's others as well.
That's such a fascinating example, and the scale to which you can take it, right? Once you start with that small demographic, small population, and then expand it out globally. I'm a optimist, but I think I'm a pragmatic optimist. That's
Yeah.
why I talk so much about trust and risk in AI, so that we can get it right and really tap into this powerful technology. What are some of the trends that you're seeing that actually worries you and that you don't think is getting enough attention, and really that's something that's needed to be looked at for AI to reach its full potential?
Yeah, I think one of the trends which I see tapering off was this, in my opinion, excessive focus on existential risks. Again,
Mm.
not that they're not there, but I think it clouded a lot of the discussions around immediate risks, right? Where did the data come from? How is it sourced? How is it trained? Are there implicit biases in that that actually could have negative consequences here, right? If you order a pizza and it goes to the wrong house and there's something wrong with the AI, it's like, okay, not a big deal. If you're using AI in a health setting and you get the wrong medicine or
Yep.
the wrong dosage because of how the tool was used, much different story, right? And these are really immediate, right? This isn't 30 years away. These are things that we
Yeah.
have to address today. So I think
Yeah.
that's one element. Actually, I see more positive trends overall. Again, if we look back 6 months ago, we, do we want open source models or do we want proprietary models? And, when we've, worked together and we've brought leaders together, we realize that they're actually not so far apart. And one of the things that we do recognize is the need for cooperation, continued exploration, that there will be multiple approaches, multiple models. There's not one size fits all approach in any of these areas. And I think that's a really healthy realization that I think 6 months ago was completely lost in a lot of these debates that were kind of over amplified and not necessarily understood by most people there. On a positive side in the trends that I see, one is just a much better recognition of the importance of data. If you go back 5 years, even 3 years ago, data is not normally something that gets most people excited. Yet now that people begin to recognize that these AI models are trained on data, again, who owns it? How is it developed? What is it missing? What are the qualities there? So we have a much better recognition of the importance of data, and that's a positive trend that we're seeing. And I think they'll have second order benefits that aren't necessarily immediately apparent here that we'll see going through, and that can actually help contribute to productivity. I think another trend is around the agents and the use of agents. I think we're still in the early days, but again, as we see more of this specialization, I think that's a really interesting area to see what kinds of agents do emerge in different fields and different sectors. And all the innovation that's taking place there is great. Maybe the last area I would highlight that it's kind of mixed. I think it's this discussion around AI sovereignty. So and by AI sovereignty, it's like, you have national sovereignty for your physical borders, assets. Okay, what does digital sovereignty look like? And so I think a number of countries now start to realize, say, well, where does this data sit? How is the model developed? Who has access to it? And in some cases, we see countries that are aiming for AI sovereignty. I think this is a bit of an illusion at some stage, in a sense that even today, countries don't have digital sovereignty. Some have more than others, but even a country like the US is dependent on semiconductor supply chains running through other countries. If you look to a smaller country, we see increasingly countries are not necessarily in a position to build their own cloud infrastructure. And they're relying on international partners to do that, just for the capability, the skills, etc. And when we look in AI, I think it's just good to be conscious and explicit about that. So it's not obvious to me, I think it's not even obvious. I think it's highly unlikely that anybody will achieve AI sovereignty. That said, I think it's a healthy discussion to have about what that means. And I think the one other area is it brings back attention on cybersecurity and the role of cyber. So in the absence of having all these tools, then what are actually the cybersecurity you have at each layer of your business or your kind of national infrastructure in the case of a government?
And Jeremy, in your role at the World Economic Forum, there is so much that you're doing to develop these healthy conversations, bring the stakeholders together. And I've had, the good fortune of working with you on launching our Center for Trustworthy Technology. When under your leadership, right? Part of your role at the forum is to lead this forum Center for Fourth Industrial Revolution. I still remember coming when when the center was set up first here in San Francisco. And, these centers are amazing gathering places and, having these discussions. And having worked with you on the Center for Trustworthy Technology, I think there is so much that can be the progress can be made, having these healthy discussions and sharing best practices to drive kind of that equity, equality across for knowledge across different countries, right? I know during Davos earlier this year, you signed an agreement to establish a new center for the fourth industrial revolution in Ho Chi Minh City.
Mhm.
So can you share a little bit more about the center and what the goals for the center?
Yeah, so maybe I can explain the model a little bit overall
Oh, sure.
first, and then we can look specifically at some of the centers there. So within our Center for Fourth Industrial Revolution, we focus on the governance, use, and application of emerging technologies. And so we look at AI, metaverse, Web3, quantum computing, synthetic biology, space, climate technologies, agricultural technologies, the entire sector of kind of emerging technologies. And what's so exciting there is it's moving so quickly, developing so fast. It's something that's hard to actually stay up to date on. And so one of the
Yeah.
ways we do that is actually by working through a network of global experts that are
Mm.
actually sharing, exchanging best practices, both opportunities as well as the risks, and doing that with people outside their sectors.
Yeah.
So this is at the heart of what we're doing, and we focus on kind of three specific dimensions for each of these technologies.
Yeah.
One is, what is the transformational potential, the opportunities that are
Mm.
here, both
Mm-hmm.
for industry, but as well as for government, uh, and how will these technologies be used and improve that? What is the necessary governance around that? And
Mm.
when I use governance, I think we need to say it goes much beyond regulation. I think
Yes.
sometimes people hear governance and they think regulation or they think bureaucracy. I
Yeah.
actually flip it around. It's like,
Yeah.
again, how do we use these technologies responsibly? And this is something we're also working together on at the Center for Trustworthy Technology.
Yeah.
Yeah, how the technology is designed, developed, rolled out, feedback mechanisms. These are really important for the productive utilization or development of these technologies more broadly. And the third area we look at is inclusivity. We want to
Mm.
make sure that these technologies are not, exclusive just to the people that have bought the latest phone, the richest countries. And we saw during COVID that both rich countries and
Yeah.
individuals, well-off individuals, for the most part, there's some, exceptions there, but for the most part, did much better than people. And so, if
Mm-hmm.
you were in a large company, you probably already had a VPN. Your employees are already with mobile
Yeah.
devices. They have
Yeah.
cybersecurity policies in place. And
Mm-hmm.
so most large companies were able to pivot relatively quickly. I mean, even in
Mm.
our own organization, we literally shifted
Mm-hmm.
some physical activities within the space of a week and said
Mm-hmm.
we would move them fully virtual. And we were
Mm-hmm.
able to make that transition. If you were a small, medium enterprise, uh, this was challenging. And we saw a lot of
Yeah.
small, medium enterprises
Yeah.
collapse during this time period.
Yeah.
So with this, I think the inclusion element is really important when we design and develop these technologies, that we
Yeah.
can use them effectively for the entire global population. Now, we're doing this work at the World Economic Forum. We have our Center for Fourth Industrial Revolution.
Yeah.
But again, we're based in Europe. We have offices in Beijing, Tokyo, Mumbai, San Francisco, and so on. But technology is still a global phenomenon. So we're working with national governments, local governments, and then leading institutions to
Mm.
establish centers on either in different regional areas or on different specific topics. So, for example, in
Mm.
the center in Vietnam, we're looking
Yeah.
specifically at the role of AI, but also
Ah.
in manufacturing. People realized like, oh, our supply chains are not as resilient as we thought they
Mm.
were.
Mm-hmm.
So as a country looking in that space, okay, well, how do you actually then even leapfrog and just go to the
Yeah.
next generation? And so then we're
Yeah.
able to share and exchange those practices in
Yeah.
these different technology areas across the different network of centers. So you mentioned
Yeah.
Vietnam, but we also have center, for example, in Rwanda, in
Yeah.
Brazil, in Colombia, Japan. over 20 altogether today. And so this is really exciting, and look forward to also seeing you in May when we bring the leaders of all these different centers together with the experts in San Francisco.
What would be your perspective or advice for any business leader, given your purview, working with CEOs or having conversations with CEOs and leaders? So purely from a business perspective, what would you say?
Yeah, I'd look at four elements. The first one's really simple. Download it, play with it, download different software solutions, different applications. Don't use just one because they have different behaviors, and use it in your personal life, use it in your professional life. So just see these different use cases and make it part of your daily routine, just to understand it and see how it's there. So I think that's first one. The second one, and I think most companies are doing this, but if you haven't, is begin piloting it, right? Put it into the organization, get people pilots, do that in a managed way, because I think a lot of people will be surprised. Their employees are using it already, but they may not always be trained on, okay, should you be just dumping your documents in and asking for the summary in? And if you haven't set up the right frameworks and training environments, you actually end up with business risks, because I do know that the employees are using this quite widely already. So better to do that in cooperation with the staff to make sure that you don't introduce unintended risks as a process there. I think tied to that, the third recommendation would be to have a data strategy. If you don't already, what's the data you have today that may have value to it? What's the quality of that data? What's the data that you would need to bring in AI? Or do you have critical dependencies on data on that? But actively thinking around what your data strategy is. And I think the last element I would just look at is to do some scenario exercises. And the expression, Anna Grove, only the paranoid survive. I think this is a great place for a business leader to be paranoid and not assume that you're too far ahead, that you can't be disrupted, because we'll see people coming forward using these applications, but with different business models and different approaches. And I think running some of those scenarios out, exploring, experimenting, it's really important to actually get the most out of the tools that are there, and avoid that you're not surprised when someone comes out there. I think the disruption, it won't happen at the core. Companies that are competing with, that's around efficiency, right? Optimization. I think a lot of the disruption is going to be happening at the peripheries and from unexpected sources. And so how do you make sure that you actually start disrupting yourself before someone else comes along and does that?
Jeremy, this has been a fascinating conversation, and there is so much more we could talk about. But unfortunately, we are nearing the end of our time. So I'm going to ask you two last questions. One is, if you have to leave this audience with one piece of advice that they can take from this episode, what would you say?
Yeah, I say AI is more than AI. I think we fall into this trap of thinking around this kind of singular monolithic AI, when what you see is actually an endless number of use cases, applications, and different approaches. And so I really try and think around, how will AI, digital intelligence, machine learning, reshape processes, services, products, experiences, and that'll come in a multitude of different flavors and approaches. And it's also why I remain optimistic that this will ultimately be a growth engine for the economy and a positive contributor to society. So as the AI and all these different variations of artificial intelligence are distributed throughout the economy, in a sense, democratized and put in the hands of people, we'll actually see amazing innovation, entrepreneurship emerging from that. So that's probably, a most important element that I've been seeing through my discussions there.
Amazing. Jeremy, how can people stay connected with you and continue to learn from you? Where can they follow you? What's the best way to follow your work?
Yeah, I think the best way is through our website at the forum. We're at weforum.org. And there I share, some of the work that we're doing, for example, the agricultural work I mentioned earlier, but as well as the work of all my colleagues and team members, and also the work across this network of centers, including the Center for Trustworthy Technology. And I think that's where the wealth of knowledge is just that exchange. And occasionally I'm also able to contribute to that as well, but definitely welcome everyone to come and visit our site there and learn more about some of these great examples we discussed today.
Jeremy, this was great. There is so much our audience can learn just from this episode, and I'm sure we will have follow-up conversations. And as Jeremy said, please do follow the forum's website. It's a wealth of knowledge, truly, and I leverage it extensively. Jeremy, thanks again for being with us on the show, and I wanted to thank our audience for tuning into AI Ignition today.
Yeah, thank you, Bina, and looking forward to our next conversation in real life or through the podcast. Thank you.
Be sure to stay connected with the Deloitte AI Institute for more AI research and insights and conversations. Thank you.